You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Mikhail, PhD candidate at Northwestern University, studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, a literature enthusiast and a guy working in media.
This is the podcast for people who want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to understand these works.
If you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. All right, Matt, what are we getting into this week?
This week, we're going to be covering chapters 10 through 18 of Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita. It is the end of book 1.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So we're kind of cranking through at this point.
We're carrying.
Halfway.
We're halfway there, which is, I mean, for our longer series, this is almost a miracle of length here.
It's kind of nice.
Yeah, right. It's kind of nice to not be covering 1,200 pages at a time.
That being said, you should see what we got planned for next year. They're kind of thickies.
Right. Before we get into talking about what actually happens in this part, Matt, is there anything you want to cover going into it?
I just kind of wanted to complain about being in the middle part is all.
Yeah.
Because this is a novel that's really hard to talk about kind of piece by piece. So we're going to try, but just know, listen to the whole series because it'll be more rewarding that way.
If you started this and we've just released it, turn it off, come back once we're all done in 2 months. No, there's good things to cover, but yeah, be aware we're half developing all these points on purpose because we can only talk about so much.
Yeah, some of the interesting ideas will have to stay to the side for now, but I think nonetheless it'll still be an interesting discussion. It's a good part. There's Master, there's Margarita,
technically
parentheses Master's version, and it's still fun.
Yeah. All right, well, speaking of fun, let's have some fun by attending the Variety Theater to see a very interesting play, if you are ready.
Please. I have had tickets to this play for so long.
All right, well, that's good to know, because they've only been on sale since yesterday, so given how long that must have felt like for you.
Professors of Black Magic never come to Moscow, so I had to pick him up when I saw him.
You had to jump on it. You had no other choice.
I had to jump on that.
Right. Well, so speaking of the background of this professor coming to the stage, you obviously may recall that Professor Woland, the devil, has wreaked some
alleged
havoc.
Devil.
Alleged devil. Yeah, that's right.
Don't slander him, please.
Sorry, the devil's lawyer is there. He's correct. That's not been proven in a court of law. I can't say that. So at the Variety Theater, you may recall the director, Likhadev, gets sent to Yalta at the end of the last part. So in the morning of, we've got the financial director and the I want to say the theater's CPA. That's not right. The theater's bookkeeper. I don't think they had CPAs.
He's probably CPA.
I don't think they had CPAs in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well.
But anyway, so these two are like, hey, where's Likhadev? There's this weird performance we got to put on today, and we're ready to do that, but like, what's going on? This is weird. And they're trying to get in contact with him, but they can't until these telegrams start coming in from purportedly Likhadev saying, hey, I'm in Yalta. Do not put Woland on stage. And they're like, they do the math and they say it is physically impossible for Likhadev to have gone to Yalta in the time since we last saw him yesterday. And as they keep getting these letters, they start to believe him, but then they have this moment of like, oh, wait, there's this Crimean restaurant that just opened up not too far, like outside of Moscow, called Yalta. He must have gotten drunk at Yalta. That is what happened here. And so they don't take it very seriously. But oddly, they do get a little call, even though the landlines are not working, very mysteriously, telling them, hey, don't keep reaching out, which they find suspicious, but they kind of put under the table because there's a lot of other things going on. The CPA, the bookkeeper, Venucha, even though they've been kind of told not to go anywhere by that call, he decides, let me go just take the telegrams and investigate a little bit, even though we are pretty certain that Likhadev is simply drunk outside of town. And as he's going, several members of Roland's retinue appears, beat him up, drag him outside, and take him to Likhadev's flat, where a woman with red hair, a scar across her neck, who is not wearing anything, pulls him in for kind of oh, welcome in, kind of pulls him in for a kiss, and he falls unconscious before that point. From here, we go back to Ivan Bezdomny, or Ivan Homeless, who having an argument with himself about what exactly happened there, and is trying to write down the circumstances of Berlioz's death. But the more he writes, the more detail he feels is needed, and that extra detail kind of drives him mad, and he starts having a conversation with himself until suddenly someone appears in the window. And from there, in this moment of, sudden magic almost, we go back to the stage at the Variety Theater where Woland is ready to start getting on stage, and the financial director Rimsky is kind of out of order, even more so now, because now the CPA Varanucha has disappeared. But this admittedly unpleasant, but as he says, hardly supernatural occurrence unnerved the financial director, and yet delighted him as well that he wouldn't have to make the call for the arrival of Woland. And they all get on stage, the crowd's all there, and the curtains pull back, and Woland is sitting on stage with two members of his retinue. First of all, the cat who's sitting there, and secondarily, Koroviev. And they are introduced as the cat, Koroviev, who goes by the name of an instrument, which is French, which goes by fagot. Woland is sitting in a chair. He looks out at the crowd and asks Koroviev, hey, what do you think of the Muscovites? Have they changed? They look out at the crowd and ponder. Koroviev tells them, well, look at all these technologies they have. And then, Woland kind of says, yeah, well, I'm not so much interested in buses, telephones, and such. A much more important question is, have the Muscovites changed on the inside?
He really was the first to do What's the Deal with Muscovites?
You heard it here first, folks. Seinfeld is the devil, according to Matt, I guess.
Well, I'm just saying there's some comedic similarities.
All right, fair enough.
No, I think Woland has Kramer energy.
But Woland's about to stand up and start throwing out racial slurs on stage?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
But I did hear Michael Richards left a really big tip at this restaurant one time. Maybe that was Nathan for you. Who's to say?
Who knows? Besides, perhaps Nathan.
Perhaps Nathan Fielder.
So from there, they play some tricks on the audience, and Koroviev makes money rain from the ceiling, and the MC of the event tries to stop them, but Behemoth, the cat, pulls his head off and at the crowd's behest puts it back on. This whole crowd is wild, eyes wide. It's amazing. And Woland, sitting in the chair still, having done nothing, says, look, on the whole, Koroviev, they remind me of their predecessors, only the housing shortage has had a bad effect on them. And with that, he decides he's done with this and he disappears. But the crowd hardly notices because Koroviev keeps on playing tricks for the crowd. He makes a store suddenly appear and say, hello, all the women of the crowd, come down, get nice fur coats, get nice French perfume, get all these nice things, and other tricks he plays on individuals who come down and so on and such forth, until they command the band to play and then suddenly disappear just as Woland before them from the stage, which everyone is so underneath all this money and all these nice things they've been given to really notice or care. From there, we go back to Ivan and the stranger reveals he's another patient and begins to tell him his story. The man conveys the story of basically being that he was a historian who won a lottery at some point, and he decided to go write a book about Pontius Pilate. The master, as he is called, or as he is named, at some point, he meets, while writing this book of Pontius Pilate, he meets this woman who is not named in this part, but we will come to know as Margarita, who both of them are at this point married, but they begin this sort of relationship where they're secretly married as he's working on this novel. And it's his work that in a lot of ways draws them together. In many ways, he mentions that her attraction to his work and what he's writing, almost he feels jealous as if it's like a third person in this relationship that she is so interested in. Although he tries to eventually publish it, the people who he takes it to denounce it essentially. People start publishing denunciations of the master and his sort of religious tendencies, and deeply paranoid as a result of all this. One night he hears someone entering the house in which he lives and suddenly burns the manuscript, only for it to have been Margarita, who then tries to gather it back up and then goes to get some things and say, hey, I'll be back in the morning. And the master decides, look, too much is going on. I'm going to go turn myself in. And he goes to this asylum that they're currently in, this clinic, and voluntarily becomes a patient. Ivan asks for the rest of Pilate's story at the end of this story. And the master basically tells him that's not for him to tell. From there, we go back to the Variety Theater. As soon as people exit the theater, all these tricks that Koroviev has played, giving them coats and other goods, money, it suddenly begins to disappear, right? I mean, these things are literally like going away from their bodies. And Varanucha, the CPA, comes back. There's something feels off about it, and then it turns out to be not Varanucha, but rather another member of Woland's retinue who almost grabs Rimsky until a rooster, crows 3 times, and that drives the retinue away, such that Rimsky can run and go get a train. From there, we go back to the asylum, where, remember, a character from the last part, Nicanor Ivanovich, has the stream about speculative money and currency and all that. But at the very last moment, importantly in this chapter, Ivan, after everyone in this ward is being sedated so they can fall asleep, Ivan begins to have a dream, and that dream leads back into Jerusalem, where at this point, Jesus has been condemned to death, or Yeshua HaNozri has been condemned to death, and we follow the step-by-step of his execution, of him being put up along with the criminals, Dismas and the other one whose name I cannot recall at the moment, being put up on crosses and left to die, as from afar, Matthew Levi, or Levi the tax collector, becomes Matthew, who in this version I'm reading is named Levi Matvey. I don't know why that's funny to me, but Levi Matvey, watching from afar, who would like to kill Jesus, not because he hates him, but because he loves him so much he doesn't want to suffer this horrible death, up until a storm appears and all the centurions there decide it's not worth it to keep standing here for hours and hours as these 3 die, and kill all 3 by stabbing them with a spear before leaving. And at that point, Levi Matvey goes and cuts all 3 bodies down and take Yeshua away, before we jump back in the present day into Moscow, at which point an investigation is launched into what exactly happened after that play, where everyone got all these nice things and all this money came into the Moscow supply, which was not real money, as people find, and tricks are played, and all these things happen as people another bookkeeper for the theater tries to go give them performances revenues away in the morning. He cannot, because wherever he goes, something's going on. Everyone's singing, people have disappeared, a person has been replaced by a suit, and by the time he finally finds a place he can turn that money in, he opens up the suitcase to show them all the rubles that they'd collected at the last performance, only to find every currency imaginable except a ruble in there, and he is arrested for speculation. And in the last part, the uncle of Berlioz comes to Moscow in order to try to claim his apartment, rather selfishly, does not care much about his nephew, only to be ejected from Berlioz's apartment because the Woland and his retinue have taken up residence there. And we also have a small moment where a bartender for the Variety Theater comes and tries to get some money from them as well. And he's also similarly sent away. And that's where we leave part 1 of the novel.
It asked really great questions about God, faith, where to hide your speculative currency in gold bars, under which family members' floorboards. Right. Really important questions.
Right. Do not leave them in family members' floorboards. Do not put them in your shaft. Do not leave them in the suitcase into which you are going to turn in someone at a counter, for example. All bad places to hide your speculative currency and or otherwise ill-gotten revenues.
And perhaps do not let Michael Richards up on stage.
Right.
I found the clip.
Oh, God. Okay.
By the way.
Wait, which clip?
The Nathan For You clip.
Oh. Well, I'll go ahead and link that in the show notes for anyone who would like to have more context for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.
If you don't know what I'm talking about, which I don't think anybody ever does.
Well, that's good. That's why we have the show notes, to provide context for what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think most people are listening to me out of a sense of duty or obligation at this point.
Speaking of not knowing what we're talking about and context, is there anywhere in particular you would like to start?
I just wanted to say that this was kind of the real chaos part. I don't know if this is the philosophy Chad's favorite part. This was just the funny part.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Right.
A lot of what was happening here, minus the execution, were funny.
Right.
And it is important to remember why we read The Master and Margarita, and a large part of that is just because it is a fun, endearing kind of, at some points, read. It's just entertaining, right? It just makes you laugh, the idea of some bureaucrat just being an empty suit. Things like this.
Right.
they're funny.
Yeah. And I think sometimes when you're approaching work like this, and this is a conversation we've had, there's a difficulty in not having been like an intended reader. And in many ways, Bulgakov did not have intended readers. This was written for the Destroyer in many ways. But Bulgakov had, I think, a theoretical audience in mind, the people of his time who experienced the same things. So there's sometimes a difficulty approaching this where there might be a tendency, if you don't know what's going on, to either think that there's something that you don't get, like literature-wise going on here, like there's something for you to decode here. And I think for some elements that is true, but there's also a lot of elements in which it is meant to be a joke and it's meant to be funny. People who experience this, there's the bartender when he goes to the Woland has this iconic scene where I don't think it's Woland, I think it's one of the other members of the retinue starts kind of abusing him over the fish. Like that was, rotten fish. And the guy says, no, we got it directly from, wherever they got it from. And it was, I grant, was not fresh, but it was second grade fresh. That's the best we can get it. And, the retinue starts abusing him and saying, second grade fresh, that's not a real thing. That's just rotten fish. And that's a more egregious example. Like, I don't think anyone would take that as sort of something being hidden, but in a lot of ways, these frustrations that I think Bulgakov is conveying in a humorous way sometimes can be misread as something that people don't, as like something, as a deeper message than it necessarily is, when it's, as you say, in a lot of ways trying to be funny, trying to find humor in something that is otherwise quite frustrating.
Right. But there are also a lot of symbols.
And there are that too. That is the difficulty, that it does exist. Symbols do exist, but they're not all of them are, and teasing them apart is the difficulty.
Yeah, I think that part of the book on my, whatever this read through is for me on it, is kind of just kind of being along for the journey a little bit, I think that, and I don't know if this is controversial to say, but I think you can, this is a book that's really within most people's grasp without really needing a lot of extra secondary whatever, It gets through the intended point, which is just to be satirical, to be funny, to be enjoyable. There are a lot more avenues that you could continue to read up on this and analyze this, but I think that it's just, on face value, just a fun book to read. And I think that's what's most important. Now, that being said, there are a lot of symbols. I read an article about symbols this week.
About signs and symbols?
No, but that would have been pretty good.
Yeah.
Since that just came out when we were recording this episode.
Right. Well, okay, tell me more about...
Very topical.
Thank you, I'm always very topical. Instead of these signs and symbols, which we're so familiar with from our friend Nabokov, tell me more about the signs and symbols that you were reading about.
So I read this article called An Interpretation of the Occult Symbolism in Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita by Amy Delacour. And it was a very interesting article that kind of went thematically through a couple of different sort of core symbolic, I don't want to say tropes, but like trends or groupings, let's say. So, right, like occult symbolism, Freemasonry, general sort of mysticism. And she's asking the kind of question like, what sort of mindset or what sort of background would allow us to decode The Master and Margarita? What could we approach the text with that would sort of unlock it and make it sort of like, oh, I have the key to understanding Bulgakov finally? And I think that it sort of ends on a note which I agree with, which is sort of like there really isn't, there's really not one. There's a lot of ways that you can approach it. Like we've talked about, a lot of people approach it with a certain religious mindset. But as we discussed in our first episode, there's a lot of disagreement even still about what that means, right? Who is Woland? Is he the devil? Is there a way to interpret this? I mean, there's endless ways, and everybody who writes about this obviously tends to think that they have that sort of viewpoint. But I think as you read more and more, you find that's not necessarily do they have it as cohesive or cohesive, I guess, of a viewpoint as it may start off. And so in this article, there were a lot of interesting things that I had not really considered. I don't know that much about the symbols and rituals of Freemasonry, but this was, of course, something that really fascinated Bulgakov, and he was really influenced by Pushkin, Goethe, and Steiner, who were all Freemasons and who all wrote a lot about, or, used these sort of Freemason symbols in their writing. And the author links this to The Master and Margarita in parts that we have not discussed yet, so I won't, I'm not going to spoil this book that's been out for, almost 100 years. But
sure.
It was just interesting, and then this sort of ending that, essentially there's not one kind of way that we can necessarily approach it. And that kind of did make me think of our signs and symbols discussion and, Nabokov's referential mania, this madness that we feel as we try to decode a text when, not all of them, maybe not any of them are really meant to be decoded. It's really arguable and debatable. I do think we have a grasp on some better than others, but I don't know about you. For me personally, when I read through scholarship on Master and Margarita, I do find it like a little bit underwhelming. I just feel like a lot of the things that I find, I'm not really, like, I wouldn't bring them on the podcast necessarily.
Right.
They might be interesting. They might bring in a few points, but I kind of feel like it's, I don't know, like misses the point.
Right. Which gets to so many pieces you and I have both read, which we talked about before we start recording, and then kind of say, it's interesting, but I don't know if I'd bring it on the podcast, which is one of the great difficulties we've had bringing that on. You're right. But and one of the signs and symbols that not much in the way of decoding, but is something interesting to talk about. I kind of want to get to talking about the new Soviet man. We've talked about, in many ways, how Bulgakov is writing to his time, and a lot of his time is about this idea of the new Soviet man. So let's talk about that. Well, start off. What is that for people in the audience who may not be familiar?
This is something that will probably sound familiar to you if you are somebody who does more reading in Russian literature than just The Master and Margarita. If you've done, if you've read along, listened along to some of our other episodes that we've done, this is a debate that has gone on for a long time. And that is, can you change people? Can you make people change, essentially? If you were to remove somebody from a certain set of social and economic circumstances and place them in a different one, or if you were to raise, them in a different one, what would happen? Can you make them different, essentially? And in the case of the Soviet Union, they were trying to build the new Soviet man or the new Soviet person, and they were trying, to essentially make politically involved, good communists, people who like to work and contribute to society, and they believed that they were going to do this with their socioeconomic system. And you might think that this sounds really familiar, and that's because it probably should, because it's essentially this exact same debate that Chernyshevsky and Dostoevsky are having in the mid-19th century. And it's been going on even longer than that, but it starts to reach its boiling point, here. Or I guess even earlier than Bulgakov's writing, kind of the early 1920s. This is when this is sort of being formulated and really, really thought about in these specific terms. So this whole chapter 12 in my copy, Black Magic and its Exposure, when Woland is doing the show in the Variety Theater, and he's asking whether the Muscovites have actually changed. He's, kind of making fun, poking fun at the idea of the new Soviet man, saying that, okay, you have these people that claim that they're all good communists, but essentially I bet they're all hypocrites, and I'm going to tempt them by putting, dresses and jewels and everything on stage, and I'm going to see what they do. And of course they all are fighting like animals, trying to get all of these luxury items, not even like basic goods, right? Like, it's not like he took a bunch of people who were starving and put food on stage and, was like, fight peasants. No, these are like people fighting over French dresses that they don't need, right? These are people that are, probably already kind of well off. Evidently, a lot of them are, because they're, hoarding gold bars and whatnot.
Sure, yeah.
And so, yeah, this is the kind of idea that he's making fun of, and that kind of comes up over and over again in the course of The Master and Margarita.
Right. And as is the case, not only is it just people wanting material goods, but also much of Koroviev, what he does is targeting the specific failures of people, not just wanting material goods, but also, some powerful person here having an affair, trying to say, hey, look, trying to stand up and demand some sort of order as he would have it. And then Koroviev says, well, why don't I go ahead and kind of pull your life apart piece by piece by conveying the secrets that you would like to keep. So to your point of beyond just like wanting material goods, but also like have city folk changed, asks Woland, and Koroviev says, no, they still want things. Nope, we've still got these powerful guys cheating on their wives, and giving them in exchange for bringing people up in society. All these things are pretty much the same. Some of them, housing, worse, hard to get a good apartment. Would fear what Woland would have to say about coming into stage anywhere in the Bay Area, but yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that he's targeting the sort of like individual aspects of people, at least on one level. On the other level, he's just putting out fancy things.
Sure, yeah.
And the Muscovites are lapping it up, basically.
They love it. They love the fancy stuff.
Yeah, so it's I would say, I guess, a little bit more. I don't know. We've been talking about the nature of Woland, and he's kind of, in a lot of ways, it's sort of passive. He's more of a tempter in a lot of ways than he is, directly doing things to harm people. Although I think this is this sort of situation where he really does, directly put people in the situation. Although I guess you could argue it's still their own actions that lead to their downfall. But I don't know. He's still a supremely interesting character.
Right. I mean, he's like he throws chaos into situations by, well, first of all, there's the whole disappearing people thing, and that's its own thing worth addressing. But and outside of that, he really truly lives up to the name of the devil in the Bible, or also in the Torah, of like the questioner, Ha-Satan, of like pulling people in, asking, right, like what's going on in your life? What's going on? Are you living up to the life you purport to live up to? Are you truly as Soviet as you are, as you would say, and not really need all these nice things, not need a mistress, not need these perfumes, whatever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's it's an interesting question,
right,
as to even how much people are responsible for their own actions. I think that raises kind of an interesting question on that. It doesn't resolve it either, but it raises it for now.
Well, we're at the midpoint in the book, so I think it's it's forgivable for now.
Whether anything's even resolved, we'll see.
maybe nothing will resolve. That's we're leaving you in a cliffhanger. You have to come back to future episodes to find out. So, speaking of Soviet, let's talk about, in a lot of ways, like we've been talking about, this is satire. This is Bulgakov having fun with the life that he sees around himself at this time. And in the novel, Woland, the devil, is interrogating those things as a form of satire. But how does the satire function on a more literary level?
All right, so this was a great article. I think it's open access. I need to double check. But there's this article that I read also for this week that I really liked, called The Stalinist Subject and Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita by Jessica Merrill. And this was, I would say, actually a very well-written, easy to follow argument and paper, which is, I say, as an utmost compliment, because, well, the stereotype that academics don't write clearly is usually pretty true in my experience. So I did enjoy this read. Challenging, but quite interesting. And this is a sort of theme that kind of comes up a lot, but I think it stays on sort of a superficial level. The sort of satire of Stalinism, and it kind of, in a lot of pieces that I've read, it sort of rehashes what I deem to be like overtly obvious, like almost Wikipedia level obvious.
That's a great insult, I've got to say.
Yeah, I'm not naming anyone specific. this isn't even a specific criticism of one piece, but it does, I will say, tend to happen on books that draw in non-specialists of our field. And that is not necessarily an insult. It's just kind of something I noticed that will happen on some of these books. Where it's like, so it might be like the Master and Margarita in Russian literature might just be like so new for your own field that when you take it back and add in just a little bit of something else, maybe you have a great paper for your field, but like in ours, sometimes it doesn't really, like, yeah, no, we got it. We've already been looking at this for like decades.
Right.
So it's not like what you're bringing is not really that interesting. It's not really pushing forward what we're thinking of when we're looking at this. So anyways, I digress. This article was not that. I thought it was very interesting in the way that it was sort of formulated, discussing the two plot lines, the two timelines that we have already just started discussing from our last episode. And so I have a couple of quotes that I thought were pretty interesting from this article. She says, I will discuss first how the Moscow chapters evoke a traditional Christian subject position, and then turn to show that the Jerusalem chapters presuppose a secular modern subject. In the world of the Moscow narrative, knowledge is transcendent and omnitemporal. Humans are treated as passive objects of free will, and punishment is corporal and symbolic. In Jerusalem, on the other hand, knowledge is limited and based on empirical observation. Humans are fundamentally autonomous and self-determining agents, and punishment is meant to reform through incarceration. And we don't have to go into this last part because we haven't gotten to this this last part in the narrative yet. But I think it's interesting, right, to sort of start to conceptualize the two plot lines, because that is a major feature of the novel, and how they kind of start to get reconciled, or in this case, don't. Because Meryl argues that Bulgakov doesn't actually reconcile, but he brings them to their own conclusions, and we'll see how this works in the end. But how this sort of relates to Stalinism, she says that the dual plot, this Moscow and Jerusalem, it's not an either-or opposition, but it's a critical response to Stalinist ideology, which combines a subjectivity with a religious conception of the world as predetermined. So, in simpler terms, this sort of idea that, you know, we're the Soviet Union, we are moving towards communism, it is determined, we are rewriting every academic discipline to show how we are moving towards communism, and if it doesn't move towards communism, then it is wrong, because that is not how the world works. Right? Everything it's so certain and predetermined that it is in some sense religious. It has these very strong overlaps, especially with Christianity. And then this subjectivity that she shows is really quite interesting, and you see it most, I think, in the devil character, which is you sort of have somebody who has a level of knowledge which is outside the scope of the other characters in the novel. And so he's sort of this character that people are fascinated by, but there's not an aspect of trust there. And so you kind of don't trust what's happening at the same time, right? He's very tricky. He plays tricks on people. And so when you combine these two aspects, this sort of subjective, like, lack of trust with this sort of certainty, you get something that's kind of ridiculous. And my takeaway, at least from the article, was this is what she's comparing to being living under Stalinism, right? Where you have this really sort of strong central authority that you are not sure exactly if it's right, and we'll talk about why in a second. But at the same time, you also kind of everything else in the world, like I said, like academia and everything, all these disciplines are certain that you're moving towards a certain direction. And the reason that I say that this point in Stalinism is important, and why I think it's this is why it kind of tends to be the sort of like Wikipedia level analysis for non-specialists, right? Is it is often just portrayed, again, and we've talked about this a lot, but it's often just portrayed as this like horrible, brutal, absolute like YA dystopia sort of land. In a lot of ways it was, but there was also a period where I think this novel really kind of shines, where like people weren't onto it yet. Like people hadn't figured out what was happening. Like the average person, right? The idea that the government would, why would the government arrest communists if we're moving towards communism? That makes no sense. See what I mean? So you have this sort of like, sort of this absolute power that you're not sure if you can trust, because you assume they have this sort of knowledge that, right, clearly these people were in the wrong because they're being arrested, and because they're probably not good communists. We're all good communists trying to work towards communism, but these people were arrested, so they probably weren't. And sort of, I think the novel sort of, this part in particular, it really is a fascinating look at the sort of like the way the disappearances worked before you really kind of knew what was happening. That was kind of my takeaway from this part. And it's funny. Well, I mean, there's humorous aspects. It's dark humor, right? In hindsight, but it is still interesting.
Right, yeah. And I think we've talked about Vasily Grossman before, who obviously, we've covered...
God, Cameron can't wait to bring Grossman.
Every episode...
He was salivating.
Every episode.
I could hear you.
On my notes sheet, number one is, how do I bring Grossman into this?
It's like someone was dangling a steak in front of you, but actually behind the steak was a sheet of paper with Vasily Grossman's name written on it.
In Stalingrad, obviously, we get towards the war itself, but this sort of patriotic conception of the war and of the necessity of some of these sacrifices as he's writing Life and Fate, which is at a point when he's meeting more and more people who are coming back from the camps at that point, it begins to shift in scope. And I think there are many people who look back at this era and think of like Life and Fate Grossman, of like, well, we if I were back in that time, I would have understood. Or they'll watch, and this is a great movie, and I don't mean to knock it because I love it, but like The Death of Stalin, right? Their conception of Stalinism every night, these Black Marias going out in the streets and pulling people out. Not to say that was not a feature to many people, but to like that kind of paranoia portrayed to us as viewers of the past and viewers of these pieces of media, I think creates this conception that for everyone all the time was that sense of paranoia, when I think when you look back at the research of the era of people being interviewed at that time, even people in many camps had the perception that, well, obviously my arrest was wrong, but I don't think that's a systemic failure. I think they made a mistake with me. I don't deserve to be here. All these other people around me are traitors to the state, and I think that is I think it is correct that they are here. Bill, on what you're saying, not quite sure that everyone would recognize this as a great injustice, and for many people, it would have been just sort of this curiosity of, oh, isn't it strange how Likhadeyev's wife and everyone else's wife in this building has disappeared, and also these other neighbors have disappeared, and it's really made it easier for us to move in here, so no big deal, but kind of odd, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of, to me, that's one of the really fascinating parts about studying this era.
Right.
People assume that you want to study it because you want to expose what was bad. But I think that's like, I don't know, to take like such a, like a lawyerly approach to it. I don't know, comes at it from an angle that misses understanding, So I don't know. That's why I think that there's something to be taken away that's a little different than what people sometimes take away from this novel. Right. And maybe my stumbling makes even the slightest bit of sense for some people, hopefully.
Sure.
But yeah, this discussion on knowledge is really interesting, and I didn't really notice this until I read through this article again, that the narrator, and again, I need to go back and pay a little more attention, but this is at least the strain of argumentation from the article, which I think is interesting, that the narrator really tends to favor those who are in close proximity to Woland, and the sort of, even your own knowledge as a reader of who is doing what and like who is what essentially boils down to how close they are to Woland. And that is something we'll see more with Margarita as we get through the sort of last half of the book. But whether the narrator views people positively or negatively depends on their relationship to Woland. And this is something that's specific to Moscow, because he is, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? He's with Pontius Pilate. He's in this other plot, but the plot does not revolve around him, right? The plot in Moscow revolves around him. It doesn't exist without him, essentially. Mm-hmm. But this other one, right? It has nothing to do with it, and we'll see how this sort of colliding worldviews end. It ends fantastically and wonderfully, kind of. But it's interesting. The idea of knowledge specifically, I think, emerges here as an important sort of touchstone for the whole book.
Right. And if I can take that to a moment to specifically Ivan Bezdomny.
You can.
Thank you. I appreciate the information. Ivan Bezdomny, in the last piece I brought up, or in the last episode we had in this, I brought up a piece which argues that Ivan Bezdomny is sort of in this, as the author terms it, schizophrenic state where this Ivan Bezdomny is unable to tell the truth from fantasy, and in this case it's unclear even to us as a reader what is truth and what is fantasy, that he's between Berlioz, who's the pure realist in a sense, seeing what is true, big quotes, and Woland, who's the sort of fantastical figure, and is therefore, by being unable to really convey this pure Soviet truth, which is that the things we don't like here, Woland in particular, and Woland's activities are not real and are not happening, and Woland's activity preference for the belief that these things are in fact happening leads him to be brought to this mental facility. In this case, I think it's really interesting that he is, first of all, his name, Bezdomny, homeless, is used less often in this part. I didn't do an exact count of how often, Ivan is used versus his nickname, but I'm fairly confident that Ivan is used much more often than Bezdomny ever is in this part, especially after he meets the master. And I think it's interesting, and this is sort of a point that I pulled from an article which has other ramifications for the larger novel as a whole, but it's called Feuilletons Don't Burn. Feuilletons is French. Don't at me for how I pronounced it. Bulgakov is the master.
They don't care about pronunciation. Don't worry.
And France, no, I would never. Bulgakov is the master Margarita and the imagined Soviet reader by Maria Kissel, who points out that Ivan has an evolving consciousness, an evolving conception of society at this point, and especially after meeting the master, his attitude is changing. From the point in which he meets the devil, and he is less and less like the good Soviet poet he was at the beginning. The master kind of asks him, did you write good poetry? And Ivan, at this point, who has had this dialogue between him and his old self in the novel, says, no, it wasn't very good. And the master says, have you considered writing better poetry? And, Ivan says, I'm certainly going to stop writing the bad poetry. And I think notably, it's... from his perception, the jump into Jerusalem in this chapter, it's when he's being put to sleep. His last thoughts as he's falling asleep are the beginning lines of the chapter in Jerusalem, much in the same way that when Woland begins to tell the story in the first episode we covered, and when in his last lines of that chapter begin the next lines of Jerusalem, I think it's interesting that the knowledge that Ivan has is pushing him away from this proper Soviet poet in many ways and towards something we'll talk about more later, but that's reflected in the story and how he's treated and how he acts and how he talks about his work and even just how he's referred to. You see that changing in his treatment as well.
I also, on a sort of last kind of point on Woland, if I may, because I like him.
Sure. Matt's a big fan of the devil.
Yeah, seems like an all right guy. Big fan of magic.
Matt is the best Magic the Gathering player I do know.
Right. Yes. I'm trying to wrap up this knowledge thought in a way that's interesting, relevant. I am reminded of the sort of last part of this book where Woland is talking to the guy who runs the buffet, Andre, at the Variety Theater, who comes to him and says, hey, listen, pal, I was giving everybody change that whole night with the fake money. I was changing the fake money, that you gave in the theater, and now as a result, I have a bunch of cut up paper scraps in where I thought I was supposed to, have money, and now I'm going to have to pay them back. And not only does Woland tell him, I know you're hiding money, I know you're hiding gold bars, and I know that you're actually quite well off with the money that you have. Then he tells him he's also going to die of cancer in 9 months, and there's no reason for him to even go to the doctor because they're not going to be able to cure it. And of course, he does try to go to the doctor, and the doctor says, hey, I was first in my class at Moscow State. What are you talking about? You don't have cancer. You're not going to die. And this sort of idea that knowledge can lead to madness, that knowledge is not always maybe inherently good, right? That knowledge can have, in some ways, morality attached to it. It's kind of reminiscent of, eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I think that's where this is kind of from very first level drawing from. But it's not just the knowledge of good and evil, but the act of knowing itself, right? That carries some sort of morality with it, and something sort of, stronger with it. And that's why this conversation that we were having earlier on symbols and, like referential madness continues to be interesting, because it's almost like, Bulgakov's winking at you saying, yeah, wouldn't you like to know what it means? But you don't. And maybe it's for the best. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like maybe it's best to just enjoy the reading and leave it at a certain level.
Sure. If you're reading this, Matt says, don't think too deeply about it. Just enjoy.
Yeah, just consume it. Just buy it. Just buy copies through our affiliate links and consume it. You don't think. Just consume.
That's certainly what part won't have you believe, but we will.
No, I'm not saying don't. Don't think. I'm just saying, like, at a certain point, like, the point isn't to decode every single symbol, right? It's not to, what does this exact thing, this exact reference mean? Like, I just relax. You'll be fine. It'll still be a good read, I promise. Yeah. They still somehow got Daniel Radcliffe to write, one of the forewords in the copy I have. Don't know why he's relevant to the Master and Margarita, but sure. Russian literature is like, oh god, we finally got a celebrity. Put him in.
Hey, I'll take it. We'll take it. I don't think we usually get much in this field, so.
No, he also said he loves the Slavic literature pod.
Oh,
so.
Well, yeah. I mean, you got to take that on face value.
Yeah, Radcliffe loves that.
And you can put those words in our mouths. Just go ahead and spread that around. Yeah. That's what is in this forward.
Yeah, but I told him I don't really it's fine. I know people like you, but after what you did to BoJack Horseman on that game show, I don't know if
well, I don't have a follow-up line. I don't have a good transition for that. But
just fade to the music.
Just fade into our wrap-up, which is that Matt. Before we completely wrap up, I have to ask, what are we tackling next week?
Next week, we have already recorded the episode, but it's going to be great. It is Andrei Tarkovsky's 1972 film Solaris. I have a lot to say about it, which, for better or worse, I do.
Right.
It's a good episode.
It's a good episode. A lot to say about blue, but whether or not it means anything, but whether or not it's just him trying to convey night.
I think unlike this episode where I am just saying leave it, I will not say that in the next episode.
So,
I will decode. I will be referentially manic the next episode.
Tarkovsky is the perfect example of the signs and symbols mattering, where the colors do matter unless they do not. They were just trying to convey night. And it's really up to you to figure out which one's which.
It's going to be good.
Yeah, it will be. It was good, and it will be good when it releases to you as listeners.
To help keep our show independent and for exclusive access to notes containing all the research that went into this episode, head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. Before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current supporters.
Absolutely. That would be Ben, Jeff, Mai, Daniel, Lou, Gary, Janice, Anne, Isaac, Emily, Caitlin, Yitza, Arini, and Pack Rob. The music used in this episode was Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes.
you'll hear from us again soon.
Hey, 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 hey.